about something like 10,000 millionaires leaving the UK last year, that the amount could go down from about 3 million in 2024 to 2.5 million by 2028. The Labour government kind of lost its way. It lost its way when it decided that it was going to put up taxes quite substantially.
Now I'm going to find out why us women will have better sex under socialism. Details, Kristian. Hello and welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager at Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz, and the IEA's Public Policy Fellow and Country Manager of Freshwater Strategy, Matthew Lesh. Matthew, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be back.
It is so great. So we're going to be discussing why millionaires are leaving the UK in their droves, Kristian's latest read, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, and first we're going to be talking about what the IMF are saying about UK growth. Matthew, do you want to kick us off?
Probably the least sexy topic talking about at this particular podcast. So, of course, the IMF had their latest set of economic forecasts out this week. It coincides with the finance ministers' meeting in Washington, D.C., as was widely expected, and there have been big cuts to expectations when it comes to global economic growth, with downgrades really across the board as a result of Donald Trump's tariffs that expected to hit the global economy in a quite negative way. Now, as they said at the time when they were announcing this, there's a lot of policy uncertainty there. Even between the development of the forecasts and when they were announced, there were changes in Trump's policy, and we seem to get changes every day on that front. What I think that was particularly interesting in the UK context, though, was that while a factor, of course, in the reduction of the UK's expected economic growth, which they originally forecast at 1.6% in January, and they slightly increased the forecast in January, they've now downgraded it to 1.1%, and they've also said inflation will be as high as 3.1%, which is, as we know, a bit above target as well. Now, what the IMF's chief economist said was that the primary factor for this was not actually international, it was domestic factors at play here. And the UK, indeed, outside of the US, which had an even bigger growth downgrade, had one of the most substantial downgrades in growth in just the early parts of this year. And what the IMF talked about here was a whole multitude of factors that they think have contributed. And the first one was just the fact that the UK economy didn't grow as much as they thought it was going to in the latter parts of last year. And then they've got concerns about the increases in bills. This awful April set of increases in bills, also driving up inflation in things like energy and water and council rates. That then drive down consumer spending and therefore drive down economic growth as a result. So I suppose the point here really is, whilst everyone is in a weaker international state as a result of Trump tariffs, the UK is in perhaps in a particularly measly state all the same. And what I also found interesting about this was the fact that the longer-term forecast for the UK was not particularly good either. They think the UK is going to have about 1.4% growth over the coming years, which is not particularly positive news in the scope of the fact that we have really had stagnant growth for, I would say, almost 2 decades now in the UK, and really stagnant living standards as a result. And the fact that we're not seeing the kind of growth, there's the whole mission of this government was meant to be growth. There's the central mission, the central purpose. And you can say they're doing a few good things on that front, although a lot of negative things on that front perhaps are starting to bite first.
What, in your view, is the reason for that downgrade? I mean, of course, what was interesting is a lot of the growth that we have seen has not necessarily come from anything that Reeves or Starmer has done, but a lot of it is more quietly what Angela Rayner has been doing with infrastructure and planning, although many of us would argue that it isn't going far enough. And I think it's particularly interesting just internally within those sort of politics about what that looks like. But what do you think is sort of causing the downgrade in that growth? And of course, it's not all just the international uncertainty as a result of Trump's tariffs.
I mean, it's worth in my head always just stepping back to where we were in July last year with the new Labour government. I mean, even if we were perhaps on the more sceptical side of things, I think there was genuinely a lot of optimism, a lot of hope amongst the public in general, as well as the business community, that Labour would be a relatively stable government, especially after Tory chaos, that the UK might be a more hospitable place for investors to in order to compared to other parts of Europe or the US, and things would look on the up. What happened very quickly, though, was that the Labour government kind of lost its way. It lost its way when it decided that it was going to put up taxes quite substantially. It declared all these fiscal black holes, some of it legitimate, some of it not legitimate. But in any case, they decided to address that by increasing pay to public sector workers, kind of in a sense you could argue paying off their their union affiliates. And in order to do that, they had to put up taxes. And you've seen this increase in national insurance, increases obviously in VAT on private schools, increases the abolition of non-dom status, I think we're going to talk about soon. So you bring all those factors together, you then have this very rapid loss of confidence in the ability of this new government. And I think everything kind of flows through from there. So you add on top of that things like new employment regulations on the way that could hurt. We've seen some kind of early signs of things in the labour market turning sour, job vacancies at the lowest levels since before COVID. You I suppose you get all these kind of factors together and you don't see a big sentiment towards growth. And I suppose the inverse of this as well is when the government does talk about planning reform, fantastic. But as you've said, is it anywhere near the scale of what is necessary to address Britain's problems? And then when they talk about cutting red tape more broadly on business, what they're doing pretty piecemeal and small, like combining a few regulators together, or are they actually substantially reducing the burden in a broader sense? And I don't think the answer is that they are reducing the burden. And I think on net they're probably increasing regulatory burden. If you look at things like they're still going ahead with the football regulator, they always talk about pushing things like the Online Safety Act even further. You have the employment rights bill, the landlord regulation, it goes on and on, where Labour actually went into the election with, and we did some analysis here last year, significantly more regulatory proposals that they want to implement. Now, the Tories were doing some of those things as well. It's not like it would have changed necessarily had the Tories stayed in power longer, but it does seem like in some senses Labour is, despite their rhetoric, when you look at the detail, is not pulling back on regulation.
It is actually really interesting because they're losing all of the political capital by using rhetoric like that and saying they want to slash regulation, they want to slash red tape, they want to
go after the NIMBYs.
So they're losing all of the political capital, although obviously you could argue that it's a bit different to what the Conservatives faced. But in practical terms, not very much has changed, or at least it's, you certainly couldn't call anything that the government have been doing particularly radical. And in so many ways, as you've pointed out, Matthew, it's actually gotten worse. Kristian, what do you make of the growth downgrade?
Well, I mean, in general, my expectation of the Labour government right from the start was that they would probably be bad on taxation and labour market regulation, but quite good on housing and infrastructure development. And that is more or less what's happening. It's just that the question was always which is going to outweigh which. What we've seen so far is that the bad things on the labour market and on taxation, that has been front-loaded, that has already kicked in. That is the part that is definitive and that really has a measurable impact. Whereas the good things that we expected, it's not that was wrong. Some of it is happening, some of it is coming true, just on a much smaller scale than you would need to balance out the bad things. And this is also what the OBR says in their latest report that I think we've talked about on this podcast, that they do say by the end of this decade, we will see a higher growth rate than we otherwise would have, because there's going to be more house building. There's going to be something going on the infrastructure side. All well and good, but this is the stuff where they really have to put their political capital in, put some momentum into it, and really do quite a lot. Because from what we've seen so far, they haven't done very much, but that is already enough to raise the annual growth rate by 1/5 of a percentage point of GDP. It doesn't sound like much, but if we bear in mind this comes for free, this is costless, this is good stuff. So the logical conclusion should be double down on that, do a lot more of that. But on the on the growth forecast, well, I mean, it was already after the budget, or autumn statement, quasi budget. The OBR forecast already said, okay, they're expecting a bit of a growth boost in the short term because public spending is going up by quite a lot. I think a 4 percentage point of GDP or so. So just for Keynesian reasons, they're expecting a bit of a push. But they expect that to go into reverse and for growth to slow down again. It now looks as if we're not even getting the short-term boost. So even the brief period that was supposed to be good, we're just skipping over that and we go straight to the bad bits. And yes, it is a shame. There are really things that you can do that would not conflict with the aims of a Labour government necessarily. So today we've had the Tax Foundation. They've released their tax competitiveness report where Britain ranks 30th. So there are 29 economies with a more competitive tax system, and on their the way they define it, competitive doesn't have to mean that taxes must be low. So tax level is one criterion, but they mostly look at how distortionary is the tax system. And so you can in principle have high taxes, but still rank quite well on their list. So Sweden is, I think, number 12 or something, and with much higher taxes. Australia has an overall tax burden is almost identical to the British one, but ranks far better simply because of a more sensible tax structure. And that's the sort of thing. This isn't about implementing a Tufton Street agenda. This isn't our wish list. This is just what, say, somebody from the IFS would also say, just making taxes less distortionary, and you can have a lot of growth gains on that basis, even if you want a high tax, high spend economy still.
I think that's interesting because obviously not all taxes are created equal. And of course, some are much more damaging to behaviour and affect behaviour in different ways than others. One example is stamp duty. I mean, stamp duty is probably one of the most damaging taxes in terms of the way in which it affects people's behaviour. And it means that we've got such a sort of restrictive housing market. And of course, we already have that. So it sort of exacerbates the problem. At the IEA, we published some research that we did with Policy Engine looking ahead at the 1st of April when all of these new tax changes would come about. And some of them are really interesting. Effectively, the average household would see about just over £1,000 increase in their tax burden. So again, it is interesting from that perspective, just because a lot of these new changes come about this year, in this tax year. The national insurance contribution rise, I think, were one of the most interesting because of the rhetoric. I mean, the government said they weren't increasing taxes on working people. Working people weren't going to be affected. This was an increase in taxes on employers. And yet, of course, as we know, that's the difference between the impact of a tax and the incidence of the tax. The incidence is going to be on less jobs, low vacancies, or indeed slow wage growth, and in some cases, job losses. And as you pointed out, Matthew, that has, in some ways, of course, we don't know what has caused it, but we have seen a reduction in the number of vacancies. So it is interesting from that perspective. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think what really worries me here is the spiralling effect, because the next step the government has to take is they have to decide level of spending. So the spending review coming up, so they have to decide departmental budgets, have to put those at the appropriate levels, and then they have a budget later in the year.
June.
And in June and then probably October, November will be the budget. And the fiscal headroom that they have, the amount of surplus, that not really surplus, the amount of within their own fiscal rules of additional hit they can take is about 10 billion. That's probably almost suddenly wiped out by now because they did all the OBR projections before Trump's tariffs and before the downgrades in expected growth as a result. So, what you're going to have now is you're going to have less growth, less revenue going into the Treasury, and then they're going to have to make decisions about how they're going to handle that. Do they cut back spending and everyone will be up in arms about that, or do they increase taxes? And again, everyone, rightfully so, will be up in arms about that. And we've already gotten the situation where we know that putting up taxes is hurting economic growth. So then you get stuck in this downward spiral, this low growth, high tax economy, and it's very hard to get out of it. And it's very hard to make foot in a place where you do want to invest because the taxes are also high. Now, you can start doing things on the regulatory front, but the government, as I think you've already said, has used up a lot of its political capital for relatively minor changes and aren't necessarily achieving what they want to achieve. And then I suppose on the tax front, you could also make the point that they're making minor changes to increase, in the scheme of things, minor changes to increase revenue with negative impacts. But it's not like they're stepping back and looking at the tax system and saying, how can we redesign the tax system in a pro-growth way? Again, because that would require a lot of political capital, there'd probably be some winners and losers out of it. You'd have to kind of think about proper in-depth tax reform. Instead, they're just making changes on the margins that aren't really achieving very much. And they're effectively making the same mistake Tories have made for a long time, which is just to not try to create as few enemies as you can by not making too substantial changes to things. But in the end, then they're not achieving their policy goals, and people feel a bit poorer and a bit worse off as a result, and people aren't happy with them, and it's electorally so self-destructive.
Yeah, and on both fronts, taxation and spending, they may have already used up the political capital, because we saw at the last autumn statement, that's when the tax increases were announced, and then they've now kicked in. And that was obviously unpopular. This is when the mood started to turn against the Starmer government after this very short honeymoon period. It was surprisingly short. Well, yeah. half a day or so. And on the spending side, well, they've already had this massive backlash because of the changes to personal independence payments and the element of universal credit. That was already massively controversial. Yeah. So this may already be as far as a Labour government can realistically go on the expenditure side. So I have no idea where they think they can go next.
It is interesting from that perspective, of course, not knowing what the future holds. And of course, if things continue to get this bad, and if in the long term it continues to look this way, how much of that people can actually take in the first instance. We're going to move on just to this topic on the amount of millionaires who are leaving this country, which I picked up on. I think it was a story in the FT a couple of weeks ago, and I saw a couple different people trying to analyse it. Some people were saying, well, it's about every 45 minutes a millionaire leaves the UK, and that's been happening since the election last year. Obviously, we don't know how much of that is correlated, but very specifically on the non-dom tax regime. Now, of course, it was scrapped in 2024 by Jeremy Hunt when he was Chancellor, so of course by a Conservative government. And what they did was they said, okay, if you're a new arrival in the 4 years that you're there, you are still not being taxed on your foreign income as long as that money doesn't reach the UK. But if you are in the UK, of course, you're paying tax on the income that you receive in this country. After those 4 years, you are going to go back to being what everybody else has, which is you are taxed on your global income. And if you weren't in those 4 years, or you've been here for longer than that time, you are taxed on your global income. Now, of course, that means that so many people, so many high net worth individuals are incredibly disincentivized to stay in this country. Many of them are leaving, and we are seeing that happen probably as a result of investment opportunities in the UK as a whole. And of course, we've got to look at things from a global perspective, but this is just one example of a policy change that is disincentivizing wealthy people from being in this country. Now, of course, there are some on the left that, of course, Kristian, you like to make fun of on Twitter, that will say, well, this is a great thing. We don't want the millionaires here in the first place. But of course, we know what the impact this is having on so many people across the country. And of course, it means that those people are less likely to invest in this country. The UK as a whole has become a much less attractive place for people to invest and indeed to live. And of course, that has an impact on the hospitality sector and whether or not these wealthy people are spending money in this country. So again, this is just one example of a policy change that has had an impact overall. And I suppose this links in very nicely to what you were saying, Matthew, that actually as this country becomes less competitive, it is much less attractive for those people to stay. And the impact of that is effectively unseen.
Yeah, you've got to think about in this first instance, even from the Treasury, it's bad when those people leave the country. If you want to fund public services, we know that it's top income earners pay a disproportionate amount of tax. I guess the top 1% of taxpayers pay 40% of all tax, and the top 10% pay something like 60%. Or 70%. So it's a relatively small number of people who are contributing to funding the NHS and funding schools and paying for the welfare state. When you scare those people away because you put your thumb down too hard on the tax front, some of them, I suppose, particularly talking about the millionaires and the billionaires, people who have an immense capacity to close their laptop screen in London and open it again in Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, or New York, they're to some extent eventually vote with their feet and are going to leave the country. There have been these projections about something like 10,000 millionaires leaving the UK last year, that the amount could go down from about 3 million in 2024 to 2.5 million by 2028 as a result of this exodus. There was historically these concerns, well, not that historically really. 50 years ago, the concern in the UK was about depopulation, the number of people in the UK who were more leaving than arriving. Now, that isn't necessarily the case today. Of course, we know we have a net inward immigration. We've got to think about it in this way, which is the UK perhaps not attracting the best and the brightest, the hardest workers, the people who are going to contribute the most to the economy, who are going to be job creators, who are going to be investors, who are going to work in top-level jobs at financial institutions, all these kind of roles. If you're just really, really hurt so badly by the UK tax situation and you want to go somewhere else, and then there's a lot of young, ambitious people, maybe not even millionaires, but people who, there's a lot of a lot of cynicism about the set of people who move to Dubai in order to avoid tax. But you've got if you're an ambitious young British person, let's say you don't actually come from any money, but you want to be able to amass some wealth, well, maybe spending time in Dubai is a good idea for you because you don't have to pay any tax there at all. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting the UK becomes like Dubai. It's not realistic. But when there's just such a big kind of nexus between the very, very low level taxes you can pay in some places, and you can get just as good or well-paying jobs, versus the UK's increasingly high tax burden, because we've got to remember we're freezing income tax thresholds if nothing else. So once you get to it, it's very, very quick.
Which isn't in practice a tax rise.
It's very, very quickly you start paying high levels of tax as you begin to be successful. Not to mention the cost of housing in London that most of your income is going to anyway. The fact that public services aren't very good is also a factor we shouldn't forget. The fact the NHS isn't very good and there aren't a lot of alternative healthcare options. All these things come together when someone's deciding where they're going to live, and the UK just becomes a place not as many people want to live, who are going to be perhaps the biggest contributors. So therefore, this is where perhaps those who are more skeptical of immigration have a point, which is the UK is not attracting the kind of like high skilled people you want to attract, and it because of the design of the system, the immigration system, and a lot of the people who are kind of relatively high school or high income or ambitious or entrepreneurial are leaving the UK. And for a long time, people have sort of leave the UK when they're selling a business, because you can pay much lower taxes in other jurisdictions if you sell your business in them, rather than having to pay all the capital gains tax in the UK. And I know multiple people who've done this at the kind of high level of things. So it's not like this is exactly a new problem. You're going to get some decisions no matter what you have with the non-dom system. Some set of people will always go somewhere else to earn money because taxes are lower, and that's where the opportunities are. But I suppose you want to try to minimize that as much as you can in the design of your tax system.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just specifically with the non-dom tax status, is one example in which the assumption when making the policy change is that behaviour will stay the same, that these millionaires will remain in this country, and that effectively what they're saying is, okay, all of these different people do not pay tax on their global income. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that exemption, and so now you have to pay tax on your global income. And that assumes that those people are staying in this country and that their behaviour doesn't change. And this is really the fundamental point here. As you shift incentives and as you change policy, people do change their behaviour, and of course it means a lot of that money does just leave the country in the first place. I think it's about £8 billion that they pay. And again, people with non-dom tax status do pay tax on their UK income. Anything that's earned here, they do still pay tax on it. It's about £8 billion. A lot of that money will end up going down as a result of the fact that those people are just not having that UK income in the first place. They're not paying tax on it.
Well, I mean, this is a debate which has been going on for quite some time about how mobile are top earners really, empirically. And so there are always people who argue that millionaires may threaten to leave, but at the end of the day, they're not going to do it. So that's the Richard Murphy position. He says, well, at the end of the day, these people don't have that many options and they're rooted here and they will stay. You can tax them however much you want. And I'm guessing there are parts of the world where that is a bit closer to the truth. But I wrote about this 5 years ago in a completely different context, where I said, even if this may be true for some places, there are reasons to expect that it doesn't apply to Britain, that in this country at least, the top percentile of the income distribution is probably more mobile than elsewhere. Part of the reason is simply the English language. I mean, you have more options here rather than, say, somebody who is rich somewhere else who doesn't speak English, doesn't speak foreign languages, might not have that many places to go to. And then there's also the fact that a high proportion of the top 2% or so of the income distribution are foreign-born to begin with. So that means these people are already, they may be dual nationals, they have at least two places where they feel at home. For them, the psychological barrier of moving somewhere else is far lower than it would be for somebody who is just rooted in a particular place and who absolutely cannot imagine ever living somewhere else. That is not the situation that we have here. Here we have good reasons to expect that the top of the income distribution, and these are people who are internationally mobile, and the latest figures illustrate exactly that. This is now exactly what's happening, and we shouldn't be surprised about this. And okay, there are, as you said, there are those who say, well, great, let them leave. And in a way, I prefer that kind of leftist who just really assumes these people are just there and they're like leeches. They just suck money out of the economy and then they're not doing anything. Well, okay, if you think about it in that way, then yes, you will think it's going to be a net benefit if these people leave. In a way, I prefer these people to, you could say, that the more sinister Marxists who do know that these people contribute and who therefore want to block the way through measures like capital controls, make sure that you cannot move assets around, trying to build a fiscal Berlin Wall around the country so that they cannot leave. In a way, you'd almost want the former type to have their way for a while. And I don't want this to sound like an Atlas Shrugged novel. I'm not suggesting they should all go to some gold sculpture. But then you would see, so if we had an exodus, and if that really had a fiscal impact, that means you have to raise taxes on everyone else, or cut spending more severely than you otherwise would, well, maybe that would at least really disprove the idea that rich people aren't contributing anything. They're just rich for no reason. They just take money from others.
It's worth remembering when you try to put up taxes particularly high, you see this quite a lot. It doesn't end up raising as much revenue. When Thatcher came in, one of the first things she did was to decrease some of the UK's extraordinarily high top marginal tax rates. And when you go, whatever you think the Laffer curve as a practical use today, at some point when you put up taxes too high, it will genuinely just stop people from working or investing and result in less tax revenue. And you have this more recently when it came to attempts at wealth taxes and very high levels of income taxes in France and other places. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that as you squeeze more and more, the result is that people will be scared away from your country. And if you squeeze even more than that, the actual impact might be net negative when it comes to the amount of money it's going to even raise with the Treasury. So you've got to be really careful when you go to these efforts. How much? I suppose there's this question here of how much tax can the UK economy take? At what point does it just end up being so damaging that we are actually on the other side of the Laffer curve? Whether or not we think we are there today, at some point it has to be so damaging. And if nothing else, perhaps the design of going back to the kind of previous discussion, the design of the tax system also could be awful as well. Why are you going after rich people this way? Maybe it would be better to go after rich people through high levels of indirect taxes like VAT, because that they're spending more money consuming goods in the UK. Now, that might be more politically difficult because it's not as well targeted, but it might actually be something that would raise you more revenue and not actually discourages people from living in the country if you decide to raise revenue other ways.
Yeah, small addition to that. You don't even have to be on the wrong side of the Laffer curve for, meaning in the sense of beyond to the right of the peak, for the tax impact to be really economically damaging. Because even just being close to it, so if you're in a situation where the dynamic effect of a tax increase is only half of the static effect because of behavioral changes, even that means even when you're still raising some extra money, you're causing increasingly more and more economic damage for every extra pound that you earn. So you don't even need to be beyond the peak. Just getting anywhere near it is not where you want to be.
It's interesting, especially when we're thinking about the complexity of the tax system. Just one example of that on a smaller scale with one particular product, tobacco. We've seen that smoking rates basically haven't changed over the last few years, more recently, but the amount of money that is being raised by tobacco duties has declined by 41%. So what we can tell from that is very likely that we are basically on the other side of the Laffer curve with tobacco duties.
Black market increase.
And it's a black market increase, or indeed people are buying their tobacco products from abroad or whatever it is, but regardless, they're not buying it legally and paying tax.
I suspect it's underestimated the extent to which a lot of kind of corner stores are selling tobacco that's not taxed and that's got an illegal. It does seem to be increasing.
And I see that anecdotally. I mean, I don't know anybody in my life that buys tobacco legally, not necessarily illegally, but literally just when you are abroad, when you're able to buy it through duty free, because it is just absolutely extortionate. You're going to be paying more than double the amount. I mean, even just thinking about alcohol products, for example, about 80% of a bottle of gin is tax. So at some point that does prevent people from paying it and buying it legally, especially when there are so many other flexible options. And very, very interesting stuff, especially on the complexity of the tax system as well as how high it is. Now, I am absolutely dying to hear about this book, Kristian. So it's your latest read. Mm-hmm. It's called, what is it called? Something about socialism. Why women
have better sex under socialism.
Okay, yes. Women have better sex under socialism.
I think this is the real reward for those who've decided to listen to our boring economics chat. And now I'm going to find out why us women will have better sex under socialism. Details, Kristian. And Kristian, can you also tell us if men get better sex under socialism, or is it only women who get better?
No, only women, I'm afraid.
Do men have better sex under capitalism, and women have better sex?
But yes.
That might explain the divergent perspectives on economics. Go on.
Could well be. So yes, the argument is that under capitalism, women depend financially on men because the market economy is, or capitalism is just inherently patriarchal. And that means they cannot leave unfulfilling relationships because they're trapped for financial reasons. And therefore men have no incentive under capitalism to try harder. And there's also then the effect that under capitalism, the argument is all human relationships become more transactional. So like a market exchange, and people under capitalism think of sexual relations in that way, that the capitalist man thinks, well, I've already paid the bills, I've done my part of the bargain, and then they think they don't also need to be good lovers, and therefore ultimately sexual performance of men under capitalism is going to be lower, whereas socialist man doesn't have that possibility. Women under socialism, the argument goes, are economically independent. They don't have to stay in a relationship they're not happy with. They can leave anytime they want, and they don't have to stay with a man for financial reasons. And that means that men under socialism have to try harder to attract women in other ways. They don't have the economic means to do it. Okay, so far so good. That's for the theory. The hilariously bad part is where she tries to prove this, where she tries to because she has some surveys of in the former Eastern Bloc or in part the then Eastern Bloc. But most of the time, the closest thing to actual evidence for this, let's say, bold hypothesis comes from 3 or 4 surveys where they compare East and West German women in around the time of reunification. There were 3 or 4 surveys where they asked about how satisfied they are with their sex lives, and it turns out the East German women reported a very high satisfaction rate. West German ones significantly less so. Okay, I have no idea what explains that gap.
Killing Germans are underperforming.
Well,
it's the real problem here, Herr Niemietz, the performance of German men.
I am a bit biased, being West German myself.
Really a book designed against you. Yeah.
The trouble is the participants in that survey, they're students, right? So even on her own terms, this doesn't quite work. Because they're not yet integrated into their economy, so that the East German men and women are not integrated in the socialist economy. The West German men and women aren't integrated in the capitalist economy. So clearly, either way, whether you live in a capitalism, socialism, or something else, if you're a student, your romantic relations don't work like that yet. It's not that you're financially dependent on someone as a student.
Methodologically, how do you do a survey where you rate the quality of sex?
I haven't looked at the original source, so I think it's...
Because it's good to ask somebody that actually works in polling, but also as an individual, your value for sex is different to every other individual, so how do you quantify that?
Yeah, I guess you could say, it's about anything, really, about, when you survey people about happiness, can you really survey people about happiness? You kind of can, actually. You can generally say, on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy you are, and maybe the scale is the same for asking. Yeah. I've never looked at questions about quality of sex when it comes to polling. I think it's actually an intriguing empirical issue. You could probably go more broadly. I'd be interested to know if you tried to correlate just more broadly by country and across, let's say you cross-correlated it with the Freedom Index or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's the next paper.
This upcoming paper from Lesh and Niemietz. For the IEA, why men and women in free countries have better sex? But does that mean that the men in East and West Germany had equal quality sex and it was just the women?
West German actually better, so they were happier. So you could have been called why men have better sex.
So it does seem to me that there is an underlying kind of almost sexist logic to this book, which is it assumes that women aren't working in a capitalist economy.
So I was going to say, my main criticism of this argument is obviously the first part of the foundation of it, which is that, well, of course, in a capitalist economy, women are dependent on men, which is completely untrue. I mean, ultimately, it is financial freedom that allows women to have that kind of physical freedom in itself. I mean, one of my favourite plays is by a Norwegian playwright called The Doll's House, and the entire concept is this woman who becomes more educated and she decides to leave the family and she no longer feels as though she's trapped in her household. And I would argue that when women were allowed to have their own bank accounts, when they were allowed to keep their own money, that was significantly more important in terms of the feminist movement than even the suffragettes and being able to vote Conservative or Labour. I don't think that had significant impacts on women's financial freedom. And fundamentally, capitalism is freedom and allows those women to have the power to leave those abusive relationships or whatever it is.
But Reem, what do you say that the Stasi reading your love letters is the true definition of women managers itself?
But you have a better incentive to write good stuff if you know that somebody else is reading it too. There might be audience.
Surveillance is
not just your sex partner that's reading it, but it's also the Stasi, so therefore...
And they have experience of doing this all the time.
This is the same, actually, conclusions of some interesting studies that were done in the last few years that I looked at about Bangladeshi women, where there was this whole movement after there'd been some fires in these clothing factories to try to reduce the amount of clothing manufacture, but people call them sweatshops, but obviously relatively kind of low-level manufacturing in Bangladesh. And the result of that, it was thought that this would be great because we could increase the standards and the expectations of Bangladeshi factories. In practice, though, the way that international companies complied with this was just to basically pull out their orders from Bangladesh and take them to other countries. The net result of that was particularly bad for women because most of the workers in these factories were women who had previously basically forced to live in the kind of in a matriarchal kind of context where more or less they actually, as is described apparently in capitalism, but is the reality of life living on a farm, which is your entire life as a woman is in control of the man, who because the man controls the farm. You spend your whole life living with your first man, which is your father, and then the next man who controls you is your husband. You don't really have your own source of income, your own independence. Whilst when you move from farming-based economy to one that's more manufacturing-based, you move up on the economic ladder. Women tend to actually have far more choice and freedom and their own incomes. So it does seem like...
And then divorce rates go up as well because a lot of those women don't believe it. It's interesting when you're thinking about it from that perspective, especially in places like Bangladesh in which they have had those shifts, relatively recently, I suppose.
It's still ongoing shifts as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting, especially because the assumption in this book is that women and men will have more financial security under socialism, and that's really the misconception here.
Yeah, and what I've mentioned, these East-West surveys, that's actually the best, the strongest part, the closest thing to actual data. She then has a couple of surveys from the rest of the former Eastern Bloc, where it gets even weirder. So there's a survey from Hungary, from the as it was then the People's Republic of Hungary, where they're not even asking them about their sex lives. It's just, it shows that they had very judgmental attitudes about prostitution. And she says, this is a victory for socialism because that shows they have internalized that sex isn't a commodity that should be bought and sold on markets. And they have these, you could also just say a socially conservative attitude. Yeah. Prostitution is bad. But she interprets that as a victory for socialism. The other one is there's a survey from Poland where there's also a high rate of self-reported sexual satisfaction among women. The trouble is the survey is from 2012. But then she says, this is clearly a legacy of the old Polish People's Republic.
Despite Poland's
literally, Balshorowitz reforms and every deregulation and low taxes, that means Poland is very much not a socialist country anymore.
Is there potential issues, by the way, with control? But is there something in terms of they controlling for religion? Are they controlling for other kind of beliefs and historical tendencies? Are they controlling for the jobs people are doing and therefore how much time they have for extracurricular activities? There seems you want to ask a whole bunch of methodology questions here before you can get on. And I look forward to look at these studies and wonder how robust they are.
No, there's no control for anything. It's just these self-reported satisfaction rankings. The closest thing where that comes into play, the whether people have enough time, is she wrote about this before somewhere in a newspaper or so, and got a letter from a woman who had grown up in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, who said, well, this is not my experience at all, because life was quite rushed. I didn't even have time. And then the author berates that Czechoslovak woman and saying, well, she doesn't realize how good she had it under socialism, and she should check her privilege.
That's insane.
Yeah,
because the other thing as well is there's this whole idea, and perhaps rightfully so to some extent, which is that women were working earlier in socialist countries than they were in Western countries. It was more normalized, it was more accepted. There was this kind of feminism that did exist prior to that happening in the West. But you would think that would then have an impact on how much time people had for those kind of activities. And the other part here as well is women were working because the economies they're very poor, and they kind of women were forced to work or either by circumstance or by active law because of the levels of poverty that would exist otherwise.
I think when you're in the Soviet Union and you're on a collective farm and you're practically starving, I'm not sure that how good the sex would actually be in those circumstances. Well, it's a fascinating read, Kristian, and you have a Substack review coming out on it as well, so we can learn a bit more.
Before we finish up, though, I've asked ChatGPT to do a quick little study looking at the Human Freedom Index and the Ipsos Life Satisfaction Index, perhaps providing a more recent example of it. And it says countries like New Zealand and the Netherlands rank highly in both freedom and life satisfaction, suggesting a potential link between societal freedom and personal relationship contentment. Some nations like Colombia and Thailand exhibit high level of life satisfaction despite not ranking highly in HFI. 67% of high-income individuals reported satisfaction with romantic love life compared to 51% with lower incomes. So get rich and have better love lives, everyone.
There you go. Destroyed with facts and logic.
Thank you.
3 cheers for capitalism.
Three cheers for ChatGPT. The conclusions that we need and writing the upcoming IEA study on the topic.
Absolutely brilliant. Excellent. Well, Matthew, thank you very much. Kristian, thank you very much for joining me today. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you enjoyed this edition of the IEA Podcast and you want to learn more about our work, then check out insider.iea.org.uk.